Welcome to On the Edge, a show examining how deals actually happen in commercial real estate. Host Malcolm Davies, founder of Way Capital, speaks with professionals in development, investment, finance, and more for insights into how these business leaders get deals capitalized. Malcolm's career spans more than 20 years, during which time he has managed nearly $20 billion worth of financings. Now to your host, Malcolm.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of On the Edge. I am here with my great friend, Aaron from BRAVO Capital, the CEO. Aaron, welcome to On the Edge. And I will have to say, this is the second time we've done this. We had a technical glitch. So to everybody watching today, you got to give Aaron kudos because he's going to do this the second time with me. So Aaron, welcome to On the Edge.
Malcolm, great to be here always.
So thanks so much for... I have to say, when we found out that there was this glitch, it was just not a good feeling. So I give you tons of credit and thank you so much for doing this again. Just give the audience a bit of your background. I think one of the things about what you're doing with BRAVO, it's so interesting, is that you have a very interesting background in your career. How did you really even get into finance or commercial real estate in general? I always like to kind of start there.
Yeah, so I feel like I've paid my dues. I started out on the legal side. So I was at Skadden Arps for about 5.5 years. I actually went into the Trump organization for 2 years and then was at Gibson Dunn for, another 4.5 to 5 years, all doing real estate finance, and I think that being in the weeds, like that ends up helping out later on. If you're the guy who's chasing down when you're junior, like the environmental report and the appraisals and the zoning report and cataloging issues, like what happens later in life is like when there is an issue, you're like, oh, like I know how to handle that. Like you just do X, Y, Z, right? Like that could be fixed. Like that's not a non-starter. I think like there's a lot of value to being in the trenches, doing title, doing survey, understanding exceptions, because it all just comes around kind of later on and there's no shortcut. So that's kind of how it started. Then went to Dwight Capital, was there for about 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, went to kind of BRAVO, which was then actually Lay Commercial. It was a kind of really good HUD lender out of Arkansas, run by an exceptional man, Lyndall Lay, who I became very close with. And he was near retirement age. So actually purchased his platform, his lender from him with a whole suite of, HUD and national lending licenses, with the aspiration of, being the best at bridge and HUD lending nationwide.
Let's talk about, obviously, we're going to get into HUD today because this is a big component of BRAVO and all the things that you do. Tell us about how you see HUD and its financing instruments playing in today's volatile capital markets. I think, it's interesting how you started BRAVO and acquiring, a HUD lender, but it really feels like that HUD itself is becoming more and more important in our industry. And you're extremely well positioned at BRAVO to be there as that great provider of capital. So talk a little bit about that if you could.
Sure. So I think it's important to win on terms, and HUD frequently has the best terms. These days when we talk to owners, borrowers, their first question is often, what could you get me in terms of proceeds? How big could my loan amount be? A lot of people are still coming out of that 21, 22 aggressive lending landscape where they had max leverage and they're looking at a refinancing that involves cash in, and nobody wants to take millions of dollars out of their pocket for a cash in refi. So it used to be, that people cared about other things first, but now it's always, what can you do for me on proceeds? And HUD always wins. You have a 1.15 DSCR for your, market rate. The test is just 30 years instead of 35 years. So we've consistently seen side-by-side analyses showing other loan types, Fannie, Freddie, next to HUD, and HUD just blows everything out of the water in terms of proceeds, is also incredibly competitive on rate. And historically, one of the challenges was it takes longer to process a HUD loan than other loan types. But these days, sophisticated sponsors have thought ahead and anticipated and started the process early. And if somebody's anticipating, then it becomes the best loan product for, many multifamily and healthcare refinancings.
So let's unpack this for a bit. So there's multiple products within HUD, and what the applications of both would be. So let's start with the 223F to start with, the bridge financing or refinancing of deals that have completed. Someone like myself as an intermediary would take a deal out in the market, and we would look at, doing a Fannie, Freddie, and/or HUD or traditionally financed, refinance with a bank or a life company. Can you talk about the program itself and how it competes in today's market, and how most borrowers should think about executing a 223F and the benefits of doing that?
Right. So something we like to say is it's not the right option for every single property. For one, a lot of properties don't qualify for it. People think that it's for affordable only. That's not true. So a lot of what we do is market rate financing, just rental financing. But the properties that don't work for it, of course, are office and various types of hotel, commercial. It just doesn't work. If you're in certain types of flood zones, it doesn't work. If you're a super, high density student housing style, shared bathroom, shared kitchen style building, it doesn't work. So before somebody gets too excited, we usually say, let us at Bravo just vet it. There's, no charge. We see that as business development, and we'll just tell somebody if they're even eligible. And if they are eligible, then there is a bit of a decision tree. Somebody has to think about what they're optimizing for. If somebody's optimizing for speed, it's just not the right product, right? You can't close in 30 to 60 days ever with a 223F. And if there's an upcoming maturity, we want to make sure that our borrowers and sponsors are aware of that and don't get burned. But if somebody does have a 6 or so month time horizon and they're anticipating, then things they have to think about are, do they want the highest proceeds financing, often at the lowest rate or, at close to the lowest rate? That's also the longest loan term. So it's a 35-year fixed rate, fully amortizing term that they would be subject to. So, if somebody's interest only wants a 2-year loan, it's not for you.
Right.
But if somebody thinks that either they're going to assign the loan because it's fully assignable, assumable, or if they're just going to hold it long term, it's a fantastic product as long as you have the time.
So let's talk about the execution. One thing about HUD is that there's assumability, right? You can assume these loans. So although there's no prepayment ability, you can assume them. Can you talk about if there is supplementals or there's an ability to add on any more financing? When you think about doing a HUD execution or a HUD execution, you think about, okay, does this encumber my asset to sell it when I've owned it for the next 12 years, for example? And now I still have this 35-year loan. Talk about how an owner should or should not feel comfortable about the ability for their purchaser, someone to buy from them, how they should be thinking about this as a way, either good or bad as it relates to HUD.
Sure. And Malcolm, also, just to give a plug for you, that's why people need an advisor like you, because you're so tuned into all of the pain points and the creative ways, to navigate a loan. And it's not a fungible item. So that's such a spot on question. And that's usually one of the negative things with HUD, where people think that you typically have a 10-year prepayment penalty declining 10%, 9%, 1% each year. There is a supplemental program. It's called a 241A. It's a little bit difficult to use in some ways in that you need to use the proceeds to better the property, and there are restrictions around that. There is a surplus cash note availability, which you could layer on, but it's in some ways similar to an unsecured loan, and that's a little bit harder also to execute. So a lot of people rush into something without being thoughtful, and everybody's business plan is different and don't consider the optionality. But with somebody like you as an advisor, kind of thinking about a client's needs and thinking about what is their exit, what is their kind of game plan, how many years are they into this, things we could do to mitigate that, or we can customize their prepayment, so for a fee, instead of 10 years, kind of they could have a 3-year or anything they want for an applicable fee, so that they're not locked out. And then they're not in that situation you described where they're all of a sudden seeing the property value appreciate and then under levered and stuck in a loan that they can't easily refi without a prepay or a supplement. So trying to craft the right prepay penalty package for them is important. Sometimes people try to line up a supplemental loan provider in advance if they think that's going to be a problem. So there are a number of alternatives to work through. And while there's a 900-page map guide and people tend to think of HUD as very fixed and formulaic and mechanical, which it is, like there are different levers you could pull if somebody's thinking in advance before you close and lock the loan.
So when you think about the prepay, how should a borrower think about this? There's, you've got a 35-year loan. You can create a prepay structure for cost. But what are the general terms or general dynamics of the prepay ability or lack thereof with a HUD execution?
Right. So maybe starting with the baseline, most people aren't even aware that there's prepay flexibility. And I'd say
Right.
90+% of borrowers just go in with a 10% in their first year, 9% in their second year, and the prepay declines 1% each year over 10 years until burn off. And historically, it was a popular product for opportunity zones where you had to hold on to the property anyway for 10 or so years. It was a popular product for long-term holders, high net worth individuals who never wanted to sell because the prepay didn't bother them. But then there's been this HUD 2.0 where you see the likes of Related and Brookfield and others with their 5-year funds come into HUD and HUD type products. And you're wondering, how do they do it? And the answer is that any time before rate lock, we can decide to customize somebody's prepayment penalty for a fee and then give them a 5% or a 3% kind of, or a 3-year rather, 5-year or 3-year prepayment penalty. And the optionality there, I think, is really key. So given HUD is a longer process, a 6-month process, what can happen before rate locking is, of course, your rate could fluctuate. And different people usually have targets in their head as to what they expect or hope the rate to be. And sometimes what we find is if rates happen to go down, say they go from, a 5-handle rate to a 3-handle rate, somebody might not be so reluctant to pay an extra add-on fee to customize their prepay because they see themselves as money good anyway. And why not, right? But if rates happen to go in the other direction and hypothetically, went into catastrophic territory to, a 7% rate, people might be a lot more reluctant to say, I'll pay an extra fee and kind of customize my prepay. So the fact that we're able to say, don't worry, you don't have to decide, yet when you're signing a term sheet with us, you could think about that, along the way and make your decision at rate lock. That often works well for people.
And, to keep with the 223 app before we get into the other programs.
Sure.
When should you be talking to you on, and I know it takes 6 months, for example, but does it, let's assume someone's recently delivered a multifamily property and they're doing a pretty decent job of leasing up. They're in, call it month 5 of lease up, and they're now at, let's call it 50% of occupancy at this point. Is that the time to call Bravo, or is it before that? Or how do you see the timing of this refi execution with you guys?
So the earlier the better.
Yeah.
And we have so many stories of friends who I said, I can't help you because it's too late, right? You're too late in the process. We don't have enough time to fix something. We don't charge by the hour. We just charge our fee on closing.
Yeah.
So it's effectively free consulting, free time for somebody to just look at something for months in advance. So the worst kind of story, I think, that illustrates why it's good to contact us early, specifically for HUD, which is such a long process where it's good to have an edge, is there was this gorgeous project, multifamily rental in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And it would have been one of the nicest properties we financed that year. Marble everywhere, kind of beautiful, kind of faucets, everything. And it turned out that when we looked at it, somehow they were able to get code certified, but it was a mistake. They just didn't meet code. They didn't meet
Mm.
federal code. Kitchens were too narrow, like a wheelchair couldn't fit in. And they said, "Can we do HUD with you?" And we said, "Well, you have to be up to code, and it's different than being a debt fund. You'd have to like rip apart your kitchens, which makes no sense." And they couldn't go with us. And they really said, like, if only we started talking to you when we were in construction, even though you're not our construction lender. And if you looked at the plans, you could have just told us and called this out. So now we're working with multiple borrowers who are in the construction phase where we're not doing the construction loan for them even. And we're just consulting on making sure they're queued up for a 223F. And that works so much more smoothly.
So I mean, obviously this is in our business is all about advising, and the longer we have, the more effective we can be about making
Yep.
decisions on what to do. One part about doing 223F versus a traditional, are there any dynamics of, the application? I mean, is somebody trying to hedge a little bit as they go through the process because of the duration? Does Bravo get concerned about that? How do you handle that situation where you're working with a borrower and they decide, okay, you know what, now the market's a little bit better, conventional, for whatever reason? How do you handle that situation when that might occur?
Sure. So I think communication is helpful. Transparency is
Yeah.
helpful, kind of knowing what somebody's objectives are. And sometimes people tell us, if rates go to a certain level, they won't be able to close on this product, or vice versa. If we see rates dip, another feature we offer that a number of other lenders can't offer is an early rate lock product. So
Hmm.
even before, the end of the road, when you get HUD's approval and their firm commitment for us to fund, which is the traditional time for rate locking, if we see rates dropping precipitously and a client is focused on that, we're focused on it, we talk to them and we'd say, there's a fee for doing this too, for doing an early rate lock. There are certain risks. We have to talk about it, but we can help them with that as a feature. We could help them, with various hedging mechanisms. And sometimes even with our bridge platform, we've given people a dual option or a dual term sheet where we've said we could proceed with HUD.
Hmm.
And if for some reason either it doesn't work out in a way that you like with rates or something else, and you have an upcoming maturity and you need a safety net, we could also be your safety net with bridge until, let's say, rates come back to earth or some other event happens.
All right, this has been great. So let's talk about what I think most people, or at least myself and the like, always pay attention to, is the 221D4 program, famous construction financing program that has been available for many years. Maybe can you give the audience just a bit of the background of HUD's program for construction and multifamily, and some of the kind of attributes that you've seen in being successful, that Bravo's been successful at helping capitalize developers construction financings?
Sure. And I love the way you separated the two, Malcolm, because they're such distinct products and
Yeah.
people get them confused all the time and they're so different, right? The 223F is 6 months. A 221D4 is typically historical average around 12 months.
Mhm.
HUD is the insurer while we're the lender, so they're going to be doing a deeper insurance review for default insurance for a D4. Davis Bacon wages are required for a D4. So I
Mhm.
usually like to start with the negatives to make sure that we're giving somebody full disclosure. Why not to do a D4 if somebody doesn't have 12 months? If they can't make Davis Bacon wages work, just don't even think about it, right? It's not worthwhile. And Davis Bacon wages are kind of county by county set. You could check them on sam.gov. But if somebody could jump those two hurdles of timing and wage scale, then you have a very exciting product for you, right? Where
Yeah.
for market rate, we've typically been at 87% LTC. This is a non-recourse construction financing product that's also fully assumable. You have your same 1.15 DSCR. This is a 40-year fully amortizing fixed rate product that's interest only during the construction period. And rates have been incredibly low.
Yeah.
So, rates have been elevated for a D4 versus a 223F, but rates are still, with a 6 handle,
Yeah.
all in kind of fixed rate. Whereas we're seeing with kind of debt funds with similar leverage, 10%
It's up
plus,
there.
right?
Yeah. I hate to say that.
Yeah, you're not even seeing too many 87% LTC construction loans
No.
on the debt fund side. So just the leverage is better, the rate's better, DSCR is better. Everything, you're getting the best construction paper possible, except for it takes a long time, and there's Davis Bacon wages. So I think we were at a conference together, Malcolm, and you said something that resonated so much, which kind of was basically talking about the current construction landscape where people just, it feels like, stopped putting shovels in the ground. And just the comment that people who put shovels in the ground today, right, in a year from now or so, like when they're coming out, they're going to be really well positioned, right? And we believe that. Like, we think that, if somebody is able to think a little bit in advance, look at the end of the tunnel, everybody's saying construction doesn't pencil now, and there are tariffs and cost of materials, and there are so many headwinds, but ultimately, like, there's just this drastic undersupply, like, across the United States, right, in multifamily, and people who think a little bit ahead, who start it now, maybe with a 12-month period and the best possible kind of rate and leverage out there, like, they're going to be, and fixed, right? Like, they'll be so well positioned if they bet on themselves in that way. So this is that type of product, and really sophisticated sponsors have learned that for a D4, you don't have to have everything ready, right? Like, you don't have to have like final plans and drawings and approvals. Like, HUD has gotten good at making sure the 12 months sequences well with the natural construction process. So you have a concept meeting at the outset where you show a market study and some basics, but you could be getting your entitlements. Like, you could be working on your drawings and plans and specs and changing your unit mix and changing your budget multiple times, because that's what happens in life. Like, during the 12-month process, it doesn't have to be fully buttoned up yet. And then at the end of it, if you paid your dues with the time, you get a better product in exchange for that.
So, I mean, let's unpack that for a second, because I'm writing an article right now called "Stuck in the Ground?" ? Right, where there are so many developers that have paid a tremendous amount of money for land already, who have paid for construction drawings already, who have never even thought about doing HUD. And what's so interesting is that you can actually apply to HUD before your construction drawings are done and process along the way, which then means you're kind of running in parallel path. And then when you start to look in and unpack the overall equity cash invested with the leverage you can get from HUD, you start to realize that you don't need that institutional equity partner that you might have otherwise tried to get. And you can either do that with funding through your own internal sources or through some type of syndication or smaller group of investors that you might not have otherwise have done before, by doing a HUD execution. Because just doing rough math, right? I mean, you're doing $100 million project, or just whatever the math is, right? And it's just do something simple, and you can get an $87 million loan for that $100 million project cost, $13 million of equity. They're thinking in their head, oh, well, I need to go out and get $30 million or $35 million to invest, which is prohibitive sometimes in today's market. But if you only need to get to 13, then you already bought the land, you're in for 6 or 7 already. You're not that far off.
That's so true. And I think it's also astute to just reference the equity, because HUD also makes it easy in your example to get the last 13 million of equity. What HUD is actually not easy with is if you want additional debt, like a second mortgage, they won't allow that. But if you want a creative equity structure, if you want pref equity, if you want to bring in others, HUD's very receptive, to various equity structures. And also, we found that there are specific, very large institutional equity providers that actually prioritize deals that are going through a HUD D4. Because if you think about it from like an equity mindset, like looking at this product, it's the best type of equity kind of construction opportunity possible, because you're getting vetted by HUD for 12 months. You only have to fund if you get approved. And if you're approved, that means you had a stellar market study, that you went through an exam that kind of produced great results, and then you end up with a 6% and change fixed rate loan on your property. It's like a really grand slam home run for any equity investor. So we've actually had people, the equity investor, come to us where we didn't know the main sponsor, saying, hey, if Matthew Fisher and the Bravo team can sign off on this, that's basically like a stamp of approval. And then we'd commit to investing our equity in the D4 and solve the rest of that 13 million gap in your example.
I love it. And let's talk about some of those other things we talked about in the 223F, which is, someone, you finish the construction. It is interest only during the construction period, starts to amortize after you complete, I believe. And then you stabilize, and you've owned it for 5 years. Does it have the same similar prepay cost features as the 223F? And then is that something you can negotiate a bit one way or the other for pricing premiums and the like?
Yeah, so something that's the third product of HUD is the 223A7, which ties into that question really nicely. So the A7 is a rapid refi, and by rapid, it means typically 90 days with minimal documentation. So sometimes what happens to us, just to give you a rough hypothetical, is we'd close a D4 for $100 million and call it the rate would be a little over 6% fixed. And even in that first year, if we were to see a big drop and HUD rates all of a sudden were 3% fixed, our team would proactively call, the owner and say, guess what? It's time to refinance. And typically there would be a big pushback where the owner would say, are you crazy? I'm in year one. I would have to pay 10% prepayment fee. That's $10 million out of pocket. Why would I ever do that? And we at Bravo would then say, no, you don't understand. You're right that you'd technically be obligated to pay that 10% prepay. But with the A7, you'd be able to fold it into your new interest rate. So hypothetically, you would have a 3.25 or 3.5 type of rate instead of the prevailing market rate. But that's still way better than your 6%, and you should take advantage and lock in. So we've seen sometimes very institutional sponsors have done hundreds of millions of dollars of D4s, and they've utilized the A7 product very strategically, sometimes even multiple times in a year when rates are dipping, to keep locking in a lower rate with minimal paperwork.
How does that exactly work? Okay, so when you finish construction, you've leased up, you would then do a 223A7, which is only available on a 221D4 execution, correct? That post construction.
So it's actually, that's a great point. So it's actually available on any existing HUD loan. As long as there's a closed, stabilized HUD loan, you could do an A7.
And is that just a rate term refi? Can you do any cash out? Is there any dynamic that's unique in that regard?
So the reason why it's an expedited, 90-day refi is there's no new underwriting for a cash out. So you can recast the term, right? So if you've burnt years off your term, you can go back to your 40-year term. You can recast your loan amount. So if you've kind of taken some money off of your principal, you could start with your headline loan amount, and you could, of course, reduce the rate rapidly. But if you want to do that re-underwriting and a cash out, then you'd need to pivot to the 223F.
Got it. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. And then just, in general, what are some of the unique attributes that somebody should be aware of as it relates to, we talk about Davis-Bacon wages and the like, and I think that's also one area where folks are thinking their project costs will go up. But the reality is a lot of construction requires that anyhow. So can you talk about, is it 100% of every sub trade and everything needs to be Davis-Bacon? Does it mean that over 50%? Can you maybe get more granular in that area?
Yeah, so first, it's county by county specific as to what it means, who it applies to, what the rates are. So we first recommend that if somebody looks at sam.gov, puts in their county, they'll see what it does to their construction budget. And what we found just from experience is it's pretty rare for a HUD D4 to make sense on a market rate development in Manhattan or prime Los
Yeah.
Angeles, like that
Yeah.
just won't make sense.
Yeah.
But where we have seen it make sense is in, Red Oak, Texas, right
Hmm.
in Waco, Texas, and Louisville. Those are the types of counties where you look at your construction budget before and after applying Davis Bacon, and you kind of look to yourself and you're like, wait, that basically looks the same. And if there's not much of a delta, then it's fantastic. So it's worth going through that exercise. It would take an hour and just let somebody know if they're qualified or not.
Right. And we've seen that with you guys too. Your team's great at making sure that, what does it look like? What can it be? And the like. So we definitely appreciate that. Okay. As we
Thank you.
come closer to the end here, the one area that I would like to maybe ask some questions on is about Bravo's execution in the healthcare space, senior housing and the things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit about, how, that industry in general and how you guys work within that space? It is certainly a burgeoning place right now with the aging elements of the United States. So maybe just for a moment, if you could talk about, the healthcare industry, where HUD plays in that space, and love to understand how Bravo plays in that as well with HUD.
Definitely. We're very active with skilled nursing financing, assisted living, and even hospitals and some memory care. We and HUD finance together. Maybe to take a step back, people kind of don't really remember in early COVID how much we used to celebrate healthcare workers and what that was like in terms of critical infrastructure. But I remember every day what that's like, and people who are running skilled nursing facilities and even hospitals, assisted living facilities, they genuinely care. They care about the population. They're so needed. And if you look at some of the stats, year over year, for an industry like skilled nursing, there are 15,000 facilities or so, and it remains kind of static because it's a thankless job. It's very licensure, regulatory intensive.
Yeah.
It's hard to do. And HUD is the only financing source that I'm aware of that consistently provides long-term fixed rate financing for that industry.
Right.
So almost everybody, particularly in skilled nursing, wants to go to HUD because it's the only long-term fixed rate exit in town. And HUD appropriately has criteria where they want to make sure that the performance kind of hits certain metrics, is at a certain level kind of qualitatively, but we've really focused on kind of being a best in class financing provider in the healthcare and particularly skilled nursing space. And something to your question that's particularly exciting is HUD recently rolled out, starting with healthcare, an express lane program, which was just music to my ears because I always have to kind of start a conversation the way that we did, where I have to say it's a good product, but it takes a long time, and
Right.
you have to start with us early. But with the Express Lane, we had a recent submission that 4 days later we had an approval.
Wow.
And it was like magic. It was fantastic, and really credit HUD and kind of just government officials who made that possible. And of course, credit our underwriting team. I think the quality of the package they submitted kind of also kind of had an impact on that result. But imagine if that were rolled out on the multi side, right? Like
Mhm.
that would be incredible. So hopefully it's a sign of things to come.
I love it. And how should someone think about that space and, pricing costs? Is it meaningfully cheaper than traditional financing? Is it, you're the only game in town for certain things, which I do believe that's true as well. But, generally speak about like the competitive elements of the cost of that financing relative to market rate.
Yeah, so I think that's also much more competitive on cost. We're frequently taking out kind of banks and debt funds. We're in a kind of best case scenario. We're seeing, like a SOFR or 350 or something, that we're taking out, which depending on the day, is well over 7%. And, just as of
Yeah.
today, when we're recording this, we're dealing with a five handle all in kind of fixed
Amazing.
rate. So sponsors are excited. HUD's very excited to just help grow this space. And it's just nice to be involved in something that's both impactful and
Yeah.
adding value economically.
No question. So Aaron, I cannot thank you enough, my friend. Thank you for giving
Thank
everyone
you.
your infinite wisdom. And we'll make sure everyone knows how to get in contact with you guys. But truly, the master of all things HUD. And Aaron, I appreciate it. Proud to call you my friend. And thanks for joining us today.
Feel the same way. Great seeing you, Malcolm.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
Okay.
Thanks for taking the time to tune into our latest show. As always, you can find us through our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@wayontheedge or at our website at www.waycapital.com. Until next time, keep working on the edge.